everyone. As Isabel said, my name is Lindsey Ingraham. I am an attorney at Major League Baseball. I work very closely with John Coyles on all of Major League Baseball's drug testing programs. Do you want me to be louder? I can be louder. Oh, they said that this one picked it up enough. Okay. I'm very loud. That's what I'm worried about. You want me to use this? This seems aggressive. Please let me know if you feel like I'm shouting at you. So I'm going to discuss, as you can see from the title slide, effective collaboration and education programs, a case study. I'm going to give you a general overview of Major League Baseball. I don't know for the international people in the room, I'm not sure how familiar you are with baseball as a sport. And then I will talk about I'm going to give you some context for the Dominican Republic, and then I'll speak specifically on some of our MLB educational initiatives generally throughout Major League Baseball. And then Kelsey Erickson is going to follow up on the second half of our presentation and discuss the actual case study and the collaboration that we did for one of the pilot programs in the Dominican Republic. So, broadly, the structure of Major League Baseball, there are 30 Major League clubs consisting of 1,200 players. They play 162 games in 186 days. As you can imagine, that's a very grueling schedule. Spring training starts, when did we start this year? Valentine's Day, I think, was the report date. So February 14th, and opening day was the end of March. The postseason doesn't wrap up until the end of October. So it is a large, very significant portion of the year. Their off season is very short. The minor league clubs, so what that is each major league club has between 7 and 8 minor league affiliates. We call that their farm system. This is the players that are drafted, the players that are signed as amateurs, come in and start off at a basic level and then move up through the farm system. They start off on short season leagues, playing 56, 72 games a season, and then they move up through to the full season, where they play 140 games a season. There are approximately 7,500 players in the minor leagues at any given point in time. So we have a lot of programs at Major League Baseball. We have the Joint Drug Program. That is the Major League Drug Program. This covers all of the Major League players and is jointly negotiated with the MLBPA. The Minor League Drug Program covers all domestic and international minor league players. Because the minor league players are not represented by a union, this is not jointly negotiated and is unilaterally implemented by Major League Baseball. Then we have the international and domestic prospect programs. These are the top US and international prospects. They are tested pre-employment. Domestically, the Commissioner's Office, in conjunction with the major league clubs, identify the top 300 prospects that are projected to go at the top of the draft every year. And we also identify the top 150 international amateurs. Those prospects are subject to testing prior to signing under their individual programs. And at this point, there are not actual active sanctions that go into place for positive tests under those programs, but the clubs are informed, and we'll discuss it a little bit later. There are some financial disincentives to use because it can affect your signing bonus and where you're going to go in the draft. We have since expanded this year into testing international amateurs. I'll get into both of these programs a little bit more later, but we have the Trainer Partnership Program and the Clearinghouse Program. The Trainer Partnership Program is in the Dominican Republic. There are independent trainers, and we have worked together to register them and subject any of the players that train at their academy to random testing prior to signing a contract. The Clearinghouse Program, clubs are now able to identify any prospect beginning at age 13 that they may be interested in signing and follow them through targeted testing over the course of the year up until their eligibility. They request those tests through me, and now we can build a comprehensive profile of that player from his amateur status all the way through. Sorry, I'm switching back and forth. Then we have the Commissioner's Drug Policy. This covers me and all of Major League Baseball. It also covers all employees and all independent contractors of all 30 clubs at the major and minor league level. The banned substances list is the same. They're required to apply for TVs for the same substances. We hold ourselves to the same standards that we hold our players, and we hold the athlete support personnel that interact with those players on a daily basis to the same standards that those players are held to. The umpire drug program is the last one that is also collectively bargained. The umpires who officiate all of Major League Baseball's games are subject to pregame testing for drugs and alcohol. So I'm going to give you some context for the Dominican Republic, because I think it'll really help you understand where we were coming from when Kelsey and I did this collaboration, and we're operating in a completely different framework down there than we are in the United States, and it did require a lot of adjustment. So for those of you who are unaware, the Dominican Republic is an impoverished island country of about 10 million people. It does have a very metropolitan city. Santo Domingo feels a lot like New York sometimes, and they've got great restaurants and great dancing and big skyscrapers, and it's gorgeous. And people go to Punta Cana and stay in beautiful resorts, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. There are also a lot of tiny villages that do not have running water or electricity. And people live in what are literally shacks on the side of the street. Their annual gross domestic product per capita is only $17,000. And 30.5% of the population live below the poverty line. As you can see, that annual salary, the average annual salary is about $5,300 US, but 50% of the country makes less than $2,800 a year. And 46% of the students do not get more than the 8th grade education. That number, actually 37.5%, leave school before 7th grade. So, MLB's DR operations. Each of those 30 clubs has what we call an academy or a complex in the Dominican Republic. They're fully staffed with ATCs and medical personnel, and they have coaches that work down there. The scouting staff all hangs out down there. People come back and forth from there in the United States all the time. They have full-time personnel dedicated to everything, just like they do in the United States. The Dominican Republic Academies are actually where the DSL, which is the Dominican Summer League, that is the lowest minor league level in baseball. That's where all the international amateurs start out, and they are based out of the club's different academies. These are super secure facilities. They are massive. They are gorgeous, with big gates and security guards. The kids all live there. They have a big feel of like college dorms. They have batting cages and multiple fields, and they feed them everything. MLB itself actually has a fully operational office in Santo Domingo. We have staff down there that is completely dedicated to anti-doping, both for counseling for kids that test positive, notifications of positive test results, giving education at all of the academies and the trainer partnership program. It's quite an endeavor. So, baseball in the DR, about 12% of major league players are from the Dominican Republic. Makes up about 20% of the minor league. And as you can see, the average annual salary is $2.6 million. Players from the Dominican Republic in Major League Baseball are some of MLB's highest earners and some of the most famous players. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of some of them. Vlad Guerrero just got inducted into the Hall of Fame this year. He is like a national icon in that country. There's a lot of financial considerations there for them. Like I said, like this is an impoverished island country where some of these kids grew up living in shacks on the side of the road with no electricity. When you're weighing that against like the moral considerations of whether or not to dope, I think it's a calculus that like while we may try to say that we understand it, a lot of us actually probably can't truly understand what the considerations that go into these kids' minds. Baseball is, for a lot of them, the way out. I mean, you can imagine what even a $100,000 signing bonus does to change that family's life. So, these are some of the financial issues. The DR lacks the infrastructure to really develop youth talent. They don't have what we would typically think of as like a little league system. They do have little league games and they do play, but in a much less structured manner. It's not like when we were all in school and people were on the baseball team up and tried to make varsity in high school. That's not how it plays out down there. The independent trainers start recruiting these kids as early as age 11. And they go around and they see them playing in little league games, and then they sign contracts with their parents agreeing to care for the kids. Some of them do it at residential facilities. Some of them just bring them in for the day. They go to the trainer's academy normally about 5 days a week. They'll practice in the morning and or in the afternoon. The trainer will feed and house them, and then the parents have signed a contract so that if they ever sign a major league contract, the trainer is entitled to a very large percentage of that player's signing bonus. So as you can imagine, a lot of these kids want to be part of these academies. They want to get picked up by these trainers, and they do as young as 12, 13. It's a big, big incentive. So it's about $50 to $60 million in signing bonuses to Dominican prospects annually, ranging from $10,000 prospects that they're bringing in to try to fill a roster spot up to $2 or $3 million for the kid that they think is going to be the top signer. And as I said before, some of MLB's highest earners are from this country, and they are regarded as national heroes. There's a ton of incentive for them to be bigger, stronger, faster. They're looking for the kids who can drill the ball out of the park and can sprint to the bases. And they're looking at the kid who at 16 years old can throw 95, 99 miles an hour. There's a lot of incentive to be one of those players and to do what you can to be one of those players. And you can imagine how difficult that is when you're 15 years old. So there is a big incentive to take whatever you can to help yourself be the player that the clubs want. Another issue in the Dominican Republic is that steroids are not a controlled substance. They are not illegal. You can walk into the local farmacia on the corner and buy them off the rack. They're all available over the counter very, very easily. Everybody knows where to get them. There's also a really large injection culture. Everything is done through syringes. If you or I have a vitamin B deficiency, we're probably going to buy a vitamin or talk to our doctor about it, and he'll prescribe us a vitamin. These kids inject liquid vitamins instead. They inject NSAIDs, things that we would take a pill for, like we would take ibuprofen or even Voltaren, which is what a lot of them use, but instead of using the cream or taking a pill, it gets injected. A lot of homemade mixtures of different injectable substances are flying around out there. The trainers say that they're vitamins or they're this or they're that, but in the end, most people don't actually know what goes into the cocktails that they're consuming. So there is a lot of unknowing administration to the players by their various trainers. And as you can see, 99% of the test results in the DR since 2005 have been for anabolic steroids. We see little to no stimulant use, which is not true in the United States. So there is a difference. So the framework for addressing this has changed in the last 10 years. Previously, DR labor law would not allow us to impose any sort of sanctions. So the only legal response was follow-up counseling and education. Changes in those laws have since allowed us to monitor the players more and to impose sanctions, which has really changed the framework. So back in 2005, we were only doing education, and our positive test rate was up close to 10%. 2008, we put in education and sanctions, and that went down a lot. And then now we're in a world where we have education, sanctions, financial disincentives, and we're actively working to try to affect cultural change in the country. So, education. Early education, and this dovetails into what Kate was speaking about on John's panel last hour, is really crucial, particularly in the Dominican Republic. These players are eligible to sign when they're 16 years old. They get, that's very, very young, and until they have signed, a lot of people haven't talked to them about this, and that's what we've changed over the last couple of years. Live sessions now occur prior to signing. They also get stuff immediately upon signing, and each session has different themes. By the end of their first year in baseball, most of these players have had a presentation or various presentations on doping from different perspectives between 5 and 7 times. There's a lot of frequent repeated reminders, and this is just coming from us, and the clubs also do everything they can to remind these players. They get live and written educational materials, and we also have an online education program that I'll discuss a little bit more in a minute. We also put into place sanctions. This is the discipline structure. DSL, Dominican Summer League seasons, are 72 games. Following a first positive test result, either an adverse analytical finding or a non-analytical positive, the players are suspended for an entire season. It's 72 games. A second test result garners you a 2-season suspension. And a third positive is a lifetime ban. You can imagine how detrimental that would be to a young athlete's career. especially when you're 16 years old and you've just been suspended for a season, and now the next group of 16-year-olds are coming up to take your place, and you're not working out with your team or developing your talent because you're suspended for the year. The sanctions are imposed very swiftly after a fair appeal process. They are all publicly announced. That includes the player's name, the club that they are playing for, the substance that they tested positive for, the length of the discipline. They also makes them ineligible to play in the All-Star game, and they are not allowed to play in the postseason with their club, regardless of whether or not their suspension has terminated prior to the end of that season. So the rate of multiple violations is very low. We don't have a ton of second-time offenders. For the second-time offenders, you can imagine that it can be career-ending. Financial disincentives. As I mentioned earlier, any pre-signing drug test results are disclosed to interested clubs prior to their contract negotiations. So when the clubs come to me and say, I'm interested in prospect X, I would like to test him, and he comes back positive, maybe his signing bonus was looking like it was going to be $2 million, but now the club is saying, no, we'll give you maybe $1 million because this is the penalty for the fact that you had a dirty test, because we don't know what we're getting. The clubs don't know if the talent they were scouting was the player's talent or was enhanced by the substance that they were using. Violations, it's a very immediate cost, and you can imagine the frustration. We get calls from trainers and players and very confused, upset parents because they don't really understand what's going on. But it's a big disincentive, and that is what we're trying to focus our education on. In some ways, amongst other things, is the decreased opportunities and the decreased monetary compensation. A very, very tiny handful of players that have ever tested positive for a performance-enhancing substance in the Dominican Republic have ever made it onto a club's major league roster. As I said, we're really trying to work on the cultural change. Education through the clubhouse, getting the clubs to talk to their players about this in a different way. We've increased the access to certified supplements. In 2011, we put into place a syringe policy, so now the use or possession of a syringe or injectable substance is banned under the program, even if it's vitamin B. They're suspended for 25 games if they're caught with a syringe or an injectable substance, so we're really trying to get that out of the clubhouse because we view it as one of the largest risks when it comes to the use of performance-enhancing substances. We also put into place the investigation policy that requires cooperation with our Department of Investigations. They can be subject to additional sanctions for lying to the Department of Investigations or refusing to cooperate. We've improved all of our medical standards, and we've started, as I mentioned before, the education at the independent trainer academies. So now we're talking to the trainers and we're talking to the players when they're 13, 14, 15 years old before they've signed contracts, and we're talking to the trainers about how important all of this stuff is. We are seeing like an increased understanding that this is not acceptable, but we do need to continue to work to change the culture to a place where the financial disincentives cease to outweigh the negative cultural implications. So this is what we've been doing for educational initiatives over Major League Baseball. We had the Ahead in the Count, and it's Arriba en el Conteo in Spanish. These are newly drafted, signed players. Within a couple months of signing, we do a large-scale presentation to all of them. Multiple topics. We cover all of Major League Baseball's major policies. So it's not just the drug program. We also do mental health initiatives, domestic violence, healthy relationships, hazing and bullying, financial responsibility, to kind of try to teach them how to live in this very new world that they've been brought into, and to be a responsible player and to handle themselves responsibly and to not trip themselves up. We also do spring training presentations for every minor league player. Every year at spring training, we, and in conjunction with some of our third-party contractors, travel around to all 30 clubs and talk to every single minor league player. They see that every year while they're in the system, so the players are getting that initial induction presentation, and then they're also getting presentations every single year at spring training. This is done in English and Spanish. And this year Major League Baseball brought our online education program in-house. So we were previously running it through a third-party vendor, but this year I kind of took that over and we revamped it. And each player is required to complete the online education. We export the list of names of people who have done this and send it to the clubs and tell them who's missing. Because we can change this every single year to really hit on what we view as the hot topics that year. This year CBD was a really hot topic, so we made sure that we focused on that. It was not something that had previously been a focus of the online education. If something comes up next year, we can make sure that that gets integrated. We really try to make sure that we hit on everything that these kids are seeing every year. Rookie Career Development Program is another one. So in the United States, each club selects 4 top prospects, 3 domestic, 1 international. These are the players that they anticipate going to the major leagues next year. In the Dominican Republic, they each select 4 international prospects that they think are going to be sent to the United States. We do a lot of similar presentations to a head and account, but with a spin because of the stage in their career that these kids are in. We try to make it really engaging. I don't know how many of you have heard of Second City, the comedy troupe out of Chicago. A lot of really famous people have come out of there, and Saturday Night Live. Las Máscaras is a very similar group in the Dominican Republic. The kids down there love them. They're very famous. And they come and do skits that surround the different programs, and they do trivia and really try to actively engage them in everything that we're doing so that they're not just sitting in a room and getting talked at. Trainer Partnership Program, as I previously mentioned. So upon registration, MLB staff goes to the trainer programs, and we do a presentation for all of the parents, all of the players, and all of the trainers. We talk about PEDs, we talk about dietary supplements, we talk about all the consequences of use, and what's going to happen if they test positive. Their signing bonus is going to decrease, etc. So, as I noted, we're hosting different events too, just for the parents. We did that one the first time this year. We invited all of the parents of the kids to a completely separate event at a hotel just to discuss with the parents the best way to go about all of this. So it kind of separated them a little bit from doing it at the Trainer Academy and put them in a little bit of a space where they could talk about it a little bit differently than they might have otherwise been able to. So next steps, further development of the online education program. We piloted it this year with the minor league players. We're currently working to update it for the staff, so that all the coaches and trainers and managers will have to take it. We're also working on a version for the 40-man roster players. And we're also looking to integrate new educational models, which is where the program that we did with Kelsey comes in, the React program and Bystander intervention. And there's plans to expand that pilot program to the additional MLB academies. I think overall, our theme is that we constantly need to be changing. We need to constantly be looking at new and innovative ways to get the information in front of them. If they hear the exact same thing every single year in the exact same fashion, they tune you out. I get active eye rolls. So you have to really do whatever you can to make sure you're giving them a different way to look at this. And part of what we discussed with some of the staff is like, now, once they're in, most of these kids have been told this is bad. They've been told they're not supposed to do this. They know that maybe they shouldn't, but they've made a calculus and decided that they should. And we want to find a way to change that culture so that they understand what the alternatives are and how they can compete fairly and how they can attain their goals without feeling like they get backed into this corner to use performance-enhancing substances. So that is where our partnership with Kelsey Erickson came in the React program. So I'm going to hand it over to her, and she is going to explain our pilot program in the Dominican Republic.
Thank you. I know you. All right, we'll see how holding a mic and the clicker works for me. Okay, so thank you very much, Lindsay. I think that was a perfect setup for kind of where MLB had been, what their vision was, and then kind of how we ended up coming together. I think before I can kind of talk about the collaboration itself, I need to introduce you to the program that we had in place. So I'll start by just introducing you to kind of the program that we had and where that even began from, because we have to get there before we can kind of get to where we are today. So I actually did my PhD research a really long time ago now, but it wasn't that long. But one of the things that I looked at is I looked at how the university environment influences student athletes' attitudes and experiences and behaviors towards performance-enhancing drugs. And I represent Leeds Beckett University, which is in the UK, but you can probably tell I don't have a British accent. So I had been a student athlete in both the US and the UK. And my experiences in those two places were really different. And I wanted to see and kind of explore how that might influence, how the environment itself might influence the way that athletes experienced and approached performance-enhancing drug use. And so one of the things that I asked student athletes was, first, how they viewed them. And so when I talked to them about this, what came out of this was that all but one student athlete said, I would never use performance-enhancing drugs, totally against it, they don't belong in sport, not interested. But then I later, in those same interviews, asked them this question. So if you knew a teammate or competitor was using performance-enhancing drugs, would you report? And given that they were so opposed to using them themselves, I assumed that the answer would be yes. I don't like doping, I don't want it in sport, so I would tell if somebody else was using it. But what I found was actually less than half of them suggested that they would report, and of those, even fewer meant that they would actually report officially, instead indicating that they would go to a coach or someone of that nature. So essentially someone that could keep that information in-house. And if we look at our traditional approach to addressing performance-enhancing drug use, we basically come at it with this idea that once you become aware of doping, you have two options. You can either ignore it and do nothing, or you can blow the whistle and report to authorities. And given these two options, student athletes were generally telling me that they would do nothing. They weren't comfortable with the idea of whistleblowing, and so basically that left them with only one other option. And essentially that means that they would act as a passive bystander. So a bystander is someone that's present and witnesses a situation, but isn't actively involved. And a passive bystander is someone that's present and witnesses, but chooses not to step in and doesn't intervene in that situation. And so given these two choices, athletes were generally telling me that they would choose not to do anything and therefore be a passive bystander. But when I went back to the data with the bystander framework in mind, I quickly noticed that actually they weren't necessarily suggesting they would do nothing. Instead, they were indicating that there's actually more than two options here. And so on the right in the light color, we have the traditional approach, which is that you can ignore it and do nothing, or you can blow the whistle and report to authorities. But actually, what they'd be more comfortable doing was, in the darker color, report to someone, and as I said, that was most often their coach. Or what they would prefer to do would be to confront that person directly, to have a conversation with that person and let them know that they had a problem with this and that we needed to go forward and address this. But I'm going to go to them directly instead of going around them or going alongside to somebody else. And so essentially what athletes were demonstrating is that regardless of the situation, not everyone's going to be willing and able to blow the whistle on wrongdoing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't do something active in this space, that they can't do something to address the issue of performance-enhancing drug use in sport. And so this really prompted the idea for React. The idea was here, so we're calling for whistleblowing, we know that it's effective, and we want to encourage and empower and enable people to do that, but at the same time, we have to accept that not everyone's gonna do it. No matter how many resources we put towards that, no matter how many times we tell them, not everyone's gonna do it. But that doesn't mean they can't do something. And so that's where the vision for React came from, and it stands for Recognize and Take Action. And the original pilot of the project was funded by the International Olympic Committee, and we designed and delivered React to student athletes in the US, Canada, and the UK, across all sports and at the university level. And the main aims of the program, which I think were really key and kind of set the tone, obviously, for everything that we did within it, was number one, we wanted to increase student athletes' awareness of intervention-worthy substance use situations. And oftentimes these are situations that they probably encountered before, but they maybe not interpreted as intervention-worthy because partly they might not have known that they actually fell under anti-doping rules. Another thing is we wanted to increase their sense of personal responsibility to intervene. So not just to notice these situations, but to actually say, I have a responsibility here and I can do something in this space. And then importantly, to achieve both of those, we needed to equip them with the skills and confidence necessary to intervene. So they actually had something that they could do in these situations. Now, the way that we did this is we actually had the React program itself, and then we also delivered an active control condition. And so the active control adopted the more traditional kind of information dissemination, compliance-based messaging. It was a 1-hour session where I went in and just essentially went over the rules and regulations. Here's your rights and expectations. Here's the resources that are available to you, which at the university level across all 3 countries was more than most of them are getting anyways. Most of them do a standard online, same thing every year, and that's their education. So for a lot of them, that in and of itself was a lot of new information. So one group got that in each university, and then the other group took part in the actual intervention, which was React. And there was an assessment that the same assessment was filled out at the start of the session, the end of the session, and then 3 months after the intervention Same evaluation across both groups so that we could compare the impact of REACT versus the more traditional anti-doping education program. The way that REACT itself was set up was it was 2 sessions. So the first session essentially introduced the theories and concepts that underpinned it. So they were introduced to the bystander effect, the 5 steps towards intervention, so how they can overcome that, specific strategies that they could use to help, and this mainly focused on social confrontation. And then we introduced the REACT model itself, which I'll show you in a second. And then importantly, in the second session, they had an opportunity to actually apply those skills. So we presented them with the 4 substance use categories that you can see here, and we strategically addressed those 4 because we obviously couldn't address the entire list, but also because research and anecdotal evidence shows that those are the most pertinent issues, or at least at the time, and arguably still are the most pertinent issues specifically at the university level. And so we wanted to, again, help them recognize that, I asked them, when you hear the word doping, what comes to mind? I never got one of those as the answer, maybe performance enhancing drugs, but those are not usually what they think of when they hear the word doping. So we covered those, and they actually practice and utilize the skills that we've taught them to address situations, and I'm going to show you an example, and that is through confrontation. So this is our REACT model, and essentially what we want to do is we want to enable individuals to move quickly through the 5 steps towards intervention and then adopt a confrontation style that lies somewhere along this spectrum and actually step in and intervene in these situations. And so in the actual session, we go through each of those steps to help familiarize them with them and help them understand what they mean. And then we also introduce them to types of confrontation, and they kind of do some activities around that. So we don't just throw this up there. But this is the model that underpins the whole program. And as I said, in the university-focused one, we looked at 4 specific substance use categories. So we would give them information about each of these. Again, it's not a ton of information. It's kind of, we recognize that these are some of the main issues. We give them some evidence around them. We have some conversation around them. But really, for me at least, having now delivered this to over 500 athletes across the 3 countries, the real kind of impact part that I see is the actual discussion and dialogue and the practicing of confrontation. So not with each of the substances given the length of time limitations. We don't do this for everyone, but we break it up. At least one of them falls into each of the ways that we address through scenarios. So on 2 occasions, we have more discussion-based. So we'll give them a scenario such as this one. I'll read it out to them. I'll let you guys read it because I'm confident you can. I'll read it out to them, and then I'll invite them in groups of 3 or 4 to have a discussion and respond to these questions. So it follows with what issues, if any, does this raise, and what action, if any, would it prompt you to take? And there's no leading in, like, this should be an issue. I actually always say, like, it might not cause an issue, and that's fine too. That's a discussion you can have as well. And so they'll have a discussion in their little groups, and then I'll pull them back together depending on what time we have, and we'll have a wider discussion around that. And this provides a really interesting opportunity oftentimes for them to learn from one another, because they're often surprised by what their peer says in relation to what they did or did not have an issue with, or what they would or wouldn't do in this situation. And there's been times when, that was where they're really actually angry at the other person because they wouldn't do something. And it's not that they necessarily don't care about each other, but it's they've never had this conversation before. And so they assume the person next to them feels the same way they do. So this is a great opportunity to just kind of have some conversations around this. And we do that on a couple occasions. And then we actually practice the skills. And so, as I said, confrontation is what they said they cared most, or they'd be most inclined to do. And so we actually have them walk through a confrontation. We call it a game plan, because that's what it's officially called, but it's not really a game. But essentially what they're doing is I have already familiarized them with each of these things in bold, which are the factors that we know influence successful social confrontation. So I familiarize them with that, and then we give them a scenario, so such as the one that you just had. And in partners, they go through it and they consider each of these factors. So how might this play out? Given that amount of information, does the relationship matter? How might that influence you? Do you have a legitimate reason to confront this person? And each of these different categories. And so they work through that in partners, and then they actually practice confronting, which they all hate at first. And it's super uncomfortable and they don't want to do it, and yet they'll end up doing it. And I'll set it up with, given this is a stage situation and you're probably talking to your friend, what did that feel like? And sometimes they go way too serious and try to do it into a play, and so it's like 1 minute each. Let's just talk about it. They swap roles. They each get an opportunity to be the one that's confronted and the one that is confronting. And I'll ask them, what did that feel like? And oftentimes you'll hear giggling throughout the room, and they'll be like, it was super awkward. And that's bearing in mind that this was staged and that's your friend you're talking to. So how much more awkward would it be in real life if that's what you encountered and you didn't have anything planned or in place to actually confront the situation? And so the idea here is to provide a safe space where they can practice that, so that if and when they do find themselves in these situations, they have something that they can fall back on and feel a little more confident and prepared to actually step in and address these situations, and not assume that somebody else will, or not assume that they don't have enough skills to be able to do it. So it's very much an active and engaging conversation throughout the 2 sessions. And the thing that we kind of end on after that, or I guess it's actually alongside it because I've broken it down a little bit differently, but we also talk about the cost of not intervening. So it's one thing to tell athletes don't dope, you're responsible for yourself, but we know that people are still doping. So actually that's not enough. It's not enough for you to just not dope. We actually want to engage you to help other people decide to make that same decision that you've made. Otherwise it's not going to change. And so we kind of highlight some of the things that they should think about, like if you don't intervene, what might happen? Things that could happen reputationally, things that could happen to your career, to their career, the way it might reflect back on you, your family, et cetera, et cetera. So we go into that in a little bit more detail. But essentially what's come out of this research is, as I said, we did an assessment across or throughout the entire thing, including a 3-month follow-up. And what we found was that in relation to each of our 3 aims, in comparison to the active control, REACT had a more significant positive increase in their perceived skills to intervene, their perceived confidence to intervene, and the likelihood that they would intervene. And this was true immediately after the session, as well as it was sustained 3 months after the intervention. So we found that both were better than nothing. They both had a positive impact, but in comparison, REACT had a more significant positive increase in each of our aims compared to the active control, which was obviously a positive thing and we were very excited to find. One of the things that came out of this, though, is we knew if we wanted to go forward with it, we needed to make it as usable as possible. And so immediately following that first round, we condensed it to 1 session, and athletes themselves asked us to extend it to athlete support personnel, because they said, if we're going to be doing this, if we're going to have these skills and confidence, that we want to make sure that the people around us are reinforcing that message, are able to support us and encourage us with this, and are able to be a part of that conversation with us. So we're now delivering it again with funding from the World Anti-Doping Agency across the 3 countries as a single session, and we've extended and added a second arm, which is specifically to athlete support personnel. So more to come on that in a year. But that leads us to where we are today with Major League Baseball. So essentially we have this program at the university, that's Leeds Beckett, and that's great, and we're excited about it, and cool, we can do publications. But does that actually have impact? Like, where do we want to go from there? Can we do more with this? And who are the people that would actually benefit from it? And it's not going to be me or any of us in academia. So we started thinking about who might we look to engage with and support, or use this to engage with and support. And so really, thinking about the program and where it could be most impactful, the things we were looking for is, what is a sport that has grassroots to elite level programming? What is a team sport? Because what I found in delivering it to both teams as well as individual groups of athletes was there was something really exciting and powerful about being in a team, because we could influence that team culture. Doesn't mean it couldn't be helpful when it was the individual athletes, but the team had something special with it. And then certainly we wanted somebody that was committed to doping prevention. And so me, having worked across the US and UK context, I was privy to a little bit more sport, and lacking in some, I guess, in the UK. But I had a more awareness, I guess, of some of the sports that might be of interest. And one of them for me that popped up right away was Major League Baseball. Having grown up in America, I was more familiar with this sport than maybe some of my colleagues. But this was one of the sports that we were really interested in. We kind of been at the same places at the same time for a while. And so, the first step in this collaboration was simply introducing ourselves. Kind of, we have this one thing, they have this one thing, but we never necessarily had a reason to have a conversation about the 2 things we were doing together. And so that was really the first step, and it was a very casual, literally like, hi, my name is, actually I think at a conference. But that led us to where we are now. So the first step was to form a collaborative partnership between Leeds Beckett University and Major League Baseball. And that took time, conversation. From there, once we agreed upon that we were going to do something and had a vision of what we wanted to do, as you can probably appreciate from Lindsey's presentation, we couldn't just take REACT and deliver it in the Dominican Republic. It would have been a disaster. Plus it was in English, so that would have been a problem. But so we had to contextualize it, and I mean that in every sense of the term. We then delivered it, and then we've continued to evaluate and reflect upon it. And so it's been very much an iterative process of going back between the 2 groups and kind of figuring out how we best move forward. And so I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly to kind of give you a glimpse of how this has played out for us. Not to say it would have to be this way in any collaboration, but I think it's been a really unique experience on both ends because it's been a first for both of us. So as I said, the first step was we had to agree upon what we were going to do. We knew we had a vision, we wanted to work together, but like, how are we actually going to do this, and what are we trying to achieve? And so that was the first step, was to answer some key questions. What do we want to achieve? And that was from Major League Baseball's perspective, what do you guys want to achieve? It was questions they asked to us, what do you want to achieve? Why do you want to move React outside of academia? Where are you trying to go with it? We had to talk about how you measure achievement, because for those of you that are in academia, this is a big thing. You know, we're always about impact. How do we measure, show that it's effective? Well, as you can imagine, that probably wasn't going to be the 10-minute survey that we did at the beginning, the end, and 30 months later in the Dominican. So that was a conversation we had for a long time. Timeline was key. When do we want this done? We had specific dates because there were specific events. And so that's what we had to stick to. And then we definitely needed to anticipate beforehand what the biggest challenges were going to be, because we knew there would be some, but we needed to figure out what exactly they would be. And I think Lindsey's kind of essentially already highlighted these, but an obvious one was the language barrier. They're Spanish speaking and it's in English. Education level was another one we really had to think about, because as was highlighted, you know, these are, a lot of them are 7th grade, 8th grade, if that, education level. So we had to think about the way that we shared this message, the way that it was presented. And then cultural norms were a really big one. And that was not just sport-specific cultural norms, but as Lindsey highlighted, there were some significant outside of sport cultural norms that we had to think about as well, and recognize that baseball was one piece of a bigger puzzle, and all of that was going to impact the way that these messages were received. And so these were things that we considered really early on and started having conversation about even before we agreed to do it, I think, actually, because if we weren't going to be able to solve these, then there was no point in even considering doing a collaboration. So once we kind of at least identified them, we moved towards starting to contextualize. And this is kind of a really simplified version of what we did. I actually just kind of went back through my notes and was like, wow, there was a lot of different steps to this. The first one was very much on me. I needed to understand what the Major League Baseball substance use policy and practice was. And obviously I got tons of information and insights from the people that you see here from Major League Baseball. And it was me reading and just kind of asking questions. And I'm sure the questions were super annoying a lot of the times. It was just like me wanting to make sure I understood what was already in place. And then a really important piece, at least for me, and I think we would probably agree collectively, was I needed to see it and understand it, because I didn't feel like I was going to be able to adapt it if I didn't understand with my own eyes what the context was like. And so I made a trip down there with members of Major League Baseball, and they literally just showed me around exactly the things that Lindsey said about what were the challenges and what was the real day-to-day life of these athletes and what were they experiencing. And so part of that was just reading literature. A lot of it was discussion. And then for me personally, at least, the biggest part was that visit and going down and just seeing, just observing and having conversations with people there on the ground, people at the MLB office in the Dominican Republic, as well as just people that we encountered along the way. So that was a critical piece for me, and I think for the whole project. And once we'd done that, we then started actually adapting. So again, this was very much collaborative. There's no way I could have adapted it on my own. And I equally, I was the one that had done React, and so there was no way that MLB could do it on their own, and this had to be together. And it did go through multiple iterations where I would kind of update what I thought it needed, then I'd send it to them, they'd say yes to this, no to this, we're missing this, and it would go back and forth. And I don't know how many times we did that, but there was many times, and it needed to be that. And after that, then there was the whole translation piece. So we had to then translate the entire thing into Spanish. And a key thing here was it's not as simple as just translating it into Spanish. You have to make sure that the actual message translates. So it's not just translating words, it's translating message. And there were multiple times when the message just didn't make sense. And that was really critical, where people from Major League Baseball, well, actually just from the staff office would be like, what do you mean? Like, that doesn't make sense. And so we'd have conversations even around like a single word or a sentence to make sure that the message was actually being translated the way that it was meant to be. And not just that, but that it made sense in that translation. And so some things got removed because we just realized they just didn't transfer across. And then one piece that I just added this morning in a session, because I remembered how critical it was as I reflected back on it, is before we actually delivered to the athletes, we delivered to staff members. And that was huge, and that was actually not long before. And we made some really significant, not significant, but like key changes based off the input that they received back to us, a lot around that language piece of things that they said, actually, I don't think that's going to have the message or the impact you're hoping for. Try this. And so that I think Lindsey would agree, that was a really useful exercise to get them to feed back into it as well. And so essentially that was, in a nutshell, the process that got us from the original piece of React to Major League Baseball React version 1. And as I said, this was a conversation that went back and forth throughout the entire thing. And it couldn't have happened with one of us, with one group alone. Thinking about key adjustments that were made, because there were some major ones. The first one I would say is concepts. And an interesting one for me that came out right away was we originally spoke in React about being individual leaders, and especially with student athletes, it's all about like, you're a student athlete, you're expected to be a leader. That message does not translate in the Dominican context. It's pretty much the opposite. It's all about looking out for one another, kind of being part of a brotherhood as opposed to anybody stepping out and being the one in the lead. So we immediately had to change that concept of actually that's not going to translate, and that's not the message we want to try to send. So instead it was more about looking out for one another. Another thing, and this came out of the presentation to athlete sport personnel, was they instantly said the cost benefit analysis, they're like, the costs don't outweigh the benefits. Most of them are going to say the benefits far outweigh the costs. And so we actually had a slide that said cost benefit analysis, and immediately there it was, okay, no, that's valid. We have to recognize that. And so we changed it, and it's the same concept, but now it's decisional balance. So giving them to think about the different things that are at stake here and actually at least consider them, rather than jumping into the behavior or being led into that behavior. And so again, that's just it was a simple tweak, but it could have had a detrimental impact had we have not made that tweak. And then another big one, kind of in relation to the first one, was in the original React program, the idea was about individual people making commitments. We changed that to a team pledge for this context because it was all about the team and about brotherhood. And so at the end, they committed as a team to a behavior rather than individuals stepping up and agreeing to be leaders. And then naturally, there were some pretty practical things we had to do. So one thing we recognized right away was that like the confrontation worksheet that I showed you wasn't going to work. We're thinking about the different education levels, the language levels, and just engagement and practice, and that was out. So right away that came out, and we decided instead discussions would be a really useful technique. The robust evaluation was out for the language and education levels, but also for the sake of time. We decided it needed to be shorter, and so we didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. So we had to think creatively about how we can get some sort of evaluation, and if that was even important. Is that something we actually need at this point? From Major League Baseball's perspective, as well as from academia, we had to make a decision around whether that was something we wanted and how we would do it. One of the other basic ones is wherever possible, we took out words and put in pictures. And that was for a number of different reasons, but it was a really useful way to kind of minimize the amount of translation as well as the amount of just lecturing that might feel like it needed to happen. And then this probably should have been the first one that went up, but we immediately knew it needed to go from 2 hours to 1 hour, just for the level or the age that we were going to be engaging with, the level of attention span, and even just for the sake of time that we would be taking away from their training and academy life. So this is just kind of an example of a few of the changes that we made. Obviously, the language had to be changed. We changed the React model, kept the 5 steps, but took away the words for the confrontation scale, so the model stayed the same, but the way that it was presented was different. And then we went from those individual commitments to a team pledge. And that was completely new. Essentially, at the end, we invited them to say, what do you guys want to agree to as a team? We wrote it out, and then they all came up and signed it. And that's something that we were able to have a tangible measure of impact. Maybe not in the way that an evaluation necessarily would, but for us, it was something that we felt collectively was a really good demonstration of engagement and impact. So once that happened, we then had to deliver, which is kind of important. And there was key questions that had to be asked here. So one of them was who. Up to this point, I was the only person that had ever delivered React across any context. And for a number of reasons, I probably wasn't going to be the best person to deliver in this context. One of those being that I don't speak Spanish. So we had to think about, well, I speak very poor Spanish. We had to think about who was the best person to do it. And that was just one reason. That aside, I still wouldn't have been the best person. And so collectively we agreed that we wanted someone that was going to have credibility with the athletes, someone that was familiar, that they could recognize, that they would be able to engage with. And so I was out, and we decided to use someone, a staff member from MLB, who was amazing. We then had to think about where, so who would be the best target group, and we decided on the Academies early on. Obviously, we had selected the Dominican Academies. And then again, evaluation, and that was still kind of being decided up to delivery, how that would take place. and who would do that. And again, the key question for me along each of those was why. We needed to make sure that we could always answer why we were doing each of those things. And if we couldn't give a why, then we probably didn't need to do it. And so once we delivered, then this has still been kind of an ongoing process, is reflecting and refining. There were some things that went really well that we noticed right away. There were some really practical things that could have gone better. Things as simple as like the room that we delivered in was very crowded. But those were certain things that we just had to deal with. And then conversations around where do we go from here. And we went away from that session and that night changed a few things immediately, like moving discussion up higher and taking some of the actual information out. Things like that we could really adjust quickly based on having been there, witnessed it, and we were all there for the delivery to be able to have some immediate impact and feedback into that. And so just to kind of touch on what I personally, and I shared this with John and with Lindsey, and so I think we're agreed on the things that we felt were the successes, and not just the success in the program, but I would say more so, and then the bigger piece is the collaboration. So what were things that enabled us to get from A to Z in this? And for me, a really key one was open communication. From day one, before we even agreed that we were going to do this, we were talking about what's your vision, what can we offer, how can we do this best together? And whenever we came up against challenges, we were able to go straight to one another and say, hey, what are we going to do about this? So that was critical. Another one was clear, agreed objectives. We had to make sure that we knew what we were working towards and why we were working towards that, and that we had the same vision because we were coming from different perspectives. And so we needed to make sure that we had clear objectives there. The collaboration to tailor the content. There is no way I would have been able to tailor this. And equally, I couldn't have just handed it over and had it been translated and had that have been an effective translation. So this had to be something that we did together with both of our areas of our experiences and expertise feeding into this content tailoring. And I guess I just said that, but that was a combination of sharing of information and expertise. They were the experts in Major League Baseball, and in baseball in the Dominican context, I was the expert in React, given I was the only one that had ever delivered it. And so it was very much about us pooling those together to go forward together. The site visit for me was absolutely essential. I really don't think that any of it I could have done any of the tailoring without that. Not that I didn't get really good information. And the realistic timeline was also really helpful too, because this gave us we had specific dates that we knew we wanted to deliver, or things that events we knew we wanted to target. And so that allowed us to kind of keep on track with what do we need to achieve by when, who needs to be involved, and who needs to be a part of which stage of this. And then another really key part has just been continuous reflection. And that was throughout the entire process. Before we delivered, during delivery, I was taking notes, and after delivery, reflecting back on that. And the reflection has been from both sides, which has been absolutely critical. Me from having delivered React and reflecting on kind of how I saw it play out and like what the delivery looked like, what it felt like, if it made sense. And then Lindsey and John from the Major League Baseball perspective and the Dominican perspective of, what are the things we want to make sure that we target? How can we extend this? What are the different areas that we might look to kind of address? Or maybe there's some areas within it that we can actually throw to the side and we can move on in a slightly different direction. So for me, the title of this presentation was effective collaboration. And so if I think of what allowed us to be effective in this collaboration, these are the factors that I think really made the difference. And again, this was new for both of us, or for all of us. And so I think it was a learning curve for all of us, but I think these were the things that allowed it to get from an idea to actual delivery, and now reflection and consideration for moving forward. So yeah, I think we'll open it up to just, do we have, oh yeah, you. Do we have questions? If you guys want to ask us questions about like the specific content, as well as even just about our experience of collaboration, I know that had kind of been our vision from the beginning, was just talking about the experience. So yeah, I'll hand it over to, do we just do it? No, you have a mic.
Kelsey, I have a question. Have you given any thought and had discussion around the influence of former athletes that were caught doping, in not just baseball, in all sports? We had that discussion of how to, breach that with athletes that idolize them.
Yeah, we did talk about it from a broader sport perspective, and we actually we ended up including from a broader sports perspective. Obviously I didn't show you the actual content of it, but we did bring up examples and some discussions around, what are the players that we see, what are the experiences that they've had, and it was very much from a broader perspective. And we had that in the original React as well, of here's some examples of people, and having discussion around kind of what might have got to that point as well.
Yeah. I think that was actually one of the changes that we
We
made
had
too,
to
because
do that.
originally we had, what did we have, Lance Armstrong in there?
Yeah.
And we decided that Lance probably wasn't going to be the most relatable athlete from the Dominican Republic perspective, so we did make some changes.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think first of all, it was a great presentation. But I think one of the things that when you add athletes who have doped and had that, I'm not sure it's always a good experience for the athletes, because they look at it and they say, well, this guy achieved, he made $200 million, and so yeah, I'm willing to take that. Like as you said, with the cost benefit, certainly the benefits outweigh the costs. So I think I've worked with different educational things, and we brought in ex-athletes, and when we talk to the students afterwards, I don't think it's always a positive type thing. I think to be careful with it.
I think that speaks to what Lindsey said earlier around culture. Like instead of like the logical, like moral, rational, that's not what we're looking at here, because actually this isn't our culture. And like you said, for a lot of them, like there's a lot of good moral reasons to do it. You're looking out for your family, you're protecting them, you're setting up generation after generation. And so we can come in with that message and try to do that, or we can recognize that actually that's not the message that they're looking for, and so instead we're trying to look at the culture, and that goes for all sport. That's not just this context, but it was more around the bigger picture around it. I don't know why oh, you okay.
Yeah, guys, I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting seeing the collaboration and how you guys work together from Leeds Beckett over to MLB. It's impressive. One thing you mentioned, Lindsey, was the deterrent, the kind of the 1 season for the first ban, 2 seasons, and then a lifetime ban. How does that compare to kind of what happens in Major League Baseball? I was just interested because I'm kind of old school, and I used to row like back in 2008, and if we were found doping, it was like a lifetime ban, and that's kind of what I think about lots of sports. Yeah. I'm kind of old school, and like it's the ultimate deterrent. And I know that that's changed over the years, but just interested about.
So when it comes to performance-enhancing substances, we kind of have 2 models. If you're on a full season roster, so if you're on the 40-man roster and you're playing 142 games, or if you're on a full season minor league roster and it's 140 games, the first suspension for a performance-enhancing substance is 80 games. Mm-hmm. If you're on a shorter season, so your entire season's only 72 games, we suspend you for the entirety of the season. So that 80-game suspension doubles. It's a full season for the second suspension, and then the third is a lifetime ban.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. And like we said before, we get very few repeat offenders when it comes to that.
That's good.
Yeah.
Lindsey, can I come on?
Yeah.
What's that?
You gonna talk about the one that went off free?
No. The other aspect of baseball, which wasn't part of this discussion, is we have a major league program, which we have to negotiate with the players' union, and then we have a minor league program that are not represented by the union. And over the years, both programs have been in place for going on 20 years now, but they used to be quite separate, given the challenge of having to negotiate. But over time, the players' union has certainly, come in the direction of wanting to match the minor league program, and we've seen a lot of value in having a consistent set of rules to the extent possible across the board. The one thing that Lindsey's presentation does a really good job with is, we haven't published this data, but we do have such a strong set of data that I think you can measure the deterrent value of our current suspensions. And while there can be a really lengthy discussion on whether additional games would provide an additional deterrent effect, I think given the drop-off that we've seen with the positives, the change in the culture, all the positive things that she talked about, I do think we are in close to that sweet spot. That being said, we negotiate our program every year with our players union, and if the players came to us or if we felt that there needed to be additional games tagged on, I think we would start at the major league level and then bring the minor league program up to that.
Thanks for the presentation. It's excellent work, and I think the effectiveness of the collaboration is just so obvious. My question is more conceptual. I'm wondering, do you have information about what happens when athlete A confronts athlete B, and what happens to athlete B? Do they change? Are they likely to change their behavior?
So that's not something we're evaluating in this program, or within the MLB context. One of the biggest challenges that we have with looking to evaluate confrontation is that they haven't necessarily, especially at the university level, but I think across any of them, is they have to have had the opportunity for us to measure it. And so one of the things in this second round of delivery of React that we're doing also to athlete support personnel, that was one of the things that got asked in the funding feedback was, well, can you account for actual confrontation, like so we can have actual evidence? So, I mean, really the only way we can do that is to ask if you've had an opportunity, and so that's what we are asking this time. And so they essentially have like an answer yes or no, and then if the answer is yes, then we ask them specific questions around that, like how did you go, can't remember the exact wording, but essentially like what was the situation that prompted it and what was the reaction that was received. So at this moment, no, I've never seen it in anything. React, the bystander framework is largely used in sexual assault and abuse, and that's where I first took it out of. There's nothing in that that talks about it, and so there is no actual measure of it. And that at this point has to be mainly through conversation. Now, if we can change that moving forward, great, but there's a lot of variables that come into play. Number one being we can't guarantee they've had the opportunity, and number two, they might not ever find out what happens as a result. And so that, though, is a conversation that we have. So that last question in the confrontation game sheet is like, how did you determine closure and assessing it? And so essentially what they have to accept is, for me, closure will be that I addressed it, I acknowledged it, then most of them decide, like, I watch. If they stop, I leave it at that. If they don't, then I consider the next move, which is to go to my coach or to go to report it more officially.
Yeah, I recognize it's a big challenge to measure this. I wonder if, like, in this academy kind of context, if you've got a unique opportunity to ask, people who are engaged with this, whether they're just aware of confrontations going on. So not even necessarily did you confront somebody, but, from before you implemented it to after, are you sort of getting the sense that these things are happening, maybe even just amongst other people? It's, not a perfect way to measure it.
No, but that is something that we talked about after, is actually, because we had originally thought about like asking the players about their experiences, and then we realized like actually it would probably be more useful or really helpful to ask the people around them. And so
particularly with the brotherhood concept.
Yeah, so we did have multiple follow-up conversations with the support personnel to see what the feedback from the players to the support personnel was. And one very specific piece of feedback that I got was that they were so excited about the pledge that they had drawn up, and they framed it and hung it somewhere prominent in the clubhouse, and that the support personnel tried to go back 3 weeks, 4 weeks later and have like another conversation to refresh it. And the club with which we piloted it has since asked us to come back again and do it this year during spring training, and we're going to look to try to expand it to some of the other academies as well.
Awesome, thank you.
I think this might be a difficult question to answer, but do you have any, could you comment on the outcomes of the educational programs in terms of both changing culture and how that's measured, and what so far has been, occurring, and whether or not you hypothesize that, in fact, you're going to get 100% change in culture or 30% change in culture, or some kind of, what do you think the overall impact might be of the kinds of programs that you're talking about?
I think you're right. I think that's very hard to measure, unfortunately. And I think a lot of it is done through anecdotal discussions, like with the trainers and with the parents, and interviews with the athlete support personnel. I think it generally still fairly much in its infancy with the amount of push that we've been doing over the course of like the last 5 years. And I mean, obviously the best metric that we have is the continual decline in our positive test rate. When we first started,
that could be deterrence as well as
exactly.
education.
No, definitely. But I think that deterrence and education play into what is a larger cocktail of what needs to be given to the players in order to help them to have successful careers and do it cleanly. It is, whether or not there's a cultural change is unfortunately very, very hard to measure unless the kids are coming straight out and admitting that they've made a different decision. And in the Dominican Republic, it can be really hard too, because there tends to be a us against them kind of mentality, and they are a team and they are a brotherhood and they're just trying to make it through. That being said, they are all in competition with each other as well.
And there's a whole issue of development as well.
Yes, exactly.
And changes in hormones.
So yeah, I think that, I really wish that there was a better metric and something that we could really, really measure. But I think that is one of the things from like the social science standpoint is we've just got to hope that what we're doing is making an impact. And at this point, one of the most important things for me is to just continuing to get the message out there to them in a different way and to present the material to them differently to try to affect that change. Because if there's one thing that I know, it's that standing up in front of them and talking at them and saying the exact same thing every year is not going to get you to the place that you need to be. So I think that as we continue to try to find ways to address it from a cultural level, then hopefully we'll just continue to move in the right direction.
I have a question here about sanctions in the Major League Baseball. Does that in adherence with the WADA, and do you work with WADA? Do you report these tests to WADA?
We are not signatories of the WADA code. So we operate completely independently, yeah.
And if I can ask, how many positive tests do you get per year or per season?
The actual specific numbers I'd have to run and are hard to quantify. I can tell you that percentage-wise, it's a fraction of a percent. What are we at, 0.4 or something, 0.5% positive test rate?
So you test that in the California lab, in WADA accredited lab, or where do you test?
We test what? Which lab?
Yes.
Different samples go to different labs. Major league samples go to Montreal. Minor league samples are split pretty evenly depending on where they're getting collected between Smirtle and UCLA.
So these are WADA accredited?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Of course.
Hi. I'm just curious if any assessment was done before heading down to the DR on what the actual culture was in terms of intake of supplements or performance enhancing substances. So, I've never been there, but for example, in Mexico, it's relatively easy to get PEDs over the counter, and understanding that these are still fairly young athletes. I mean, were they already in the US, you already have kids looking at this stuff.
Yeah. So Major League Baseball has been operating in the Dominican Republic for an extended period of time. And as I mentioned, we have a fully operating office there. One of our staff members that we work very closely with, a gentleman by the name of Raymond Blaze, is an educator by trade in the Dominican Republic. He is born and raised in the Dominican Republic. He has another person who reports to him that comes from the same background. They've been out there in the academies doing these presentations, talking to the people on the ground, and they're from here. And he was integral in adapting all of this. Yeah. And he's the one that Kelsey trained to do the presentation. So when it comes to assessing the culture and what's going on down there, I think we have amazing resources on the ground in the staff that are from there. And some of our staff members in the Dominican Republic are ex-baseball players. Kids who went through the independent trainer program when they were little, and kids that played minor league baseball in the DR. So we have a lot of really great resources to run all of this by, to see what will resonate appropriately and what things that we should be hitting on to make sure that we're not missing something that we may otherwise miss, because no matter how much time I spend down there, I am not Dominican. So we just need to make sure that we're really hitting everything appropriately. And I think that our staff down there is instrumental.
And I would add to that they were key, and Raymond was key in what I didn't highlight is we totally changed the scenarios and the substances that we looked at based off what he said. Hey, these are, and what you knew already, these are the things that we're dealing with. These are the ones that we're seeing as being the biggest challenge. And so we focused specifically on those. I showed you the ones we looked at student athlete level, but we tailored them for this context specifically, both the topics and the scenarios.
Yeah, and in the United States, we found that supplements are a very big issue and something that we address heavily in the United States. And we address it in the Dominican Republic, but it's not nearly as much of an issue as it is in the United States, because contaminated nutritional supplements generally are a lot harder to get their hands on. Whereas, like you said, they can go into the corner store and buy the steroids. So, and they buy syringes, and they use syringes to inject vitamin B. So addressing those cultural issues were the things that we decided to focus on the most.
And the last two questions actually can be linked by that. This is an incredibly high risk population, which is one of the main reasons that we came to Kelsey and said, please help. And I can't say enough positive things about the collaboration, and I look forward to kind of where we go from here. But while it may not be an intentional thing, this is not an unintentional ingestion situation down there. Steroids are available. They can be easily obtained, probably easier than even Mexico, even though that's where the sourcing information is coming from. But it's just a different approach. It's a different set of issues, and it actually goes to the point about our positive test rate. Unlike the US, where we're seeing more and more sophisticated things, I think it was David Howman that mentioned it this morning, talking about kind of the substances that were used in the 70s and things like that. That's what is available in the Dominican. They're easy to pick up. They're easily detectable. They hang around for an incredibly long period of time. There's not anything sophisticated down there from a substance perspective. So while we always have to take our positive test rate with a grain of salt and the kind of the downward trend of our positive test rate that we've seen over the last 10 years, given this population and the specific substances and the deterrent kind of impact and the educational campaigns that we have in place, they are more measurable, I think, or they're more reliable than they might be here.
So you mentioned that you don't like talk at these young athletes because that's not an appropriate way to engage them. So when you're going into programs that may not have had the robust education that some of the organizations have now, what tactics do you use in order to engage them in prohibited substances, and just, you know, the harms and why not to use them, and how in depth do you actually go when it comes to, you know, the different classes of substances that are prohibited?
In the the standard React program? So that's a very good question. Now, the idea behind it is essentially we're not going there to necessarily give them specific details about the substances, but I will give them information. But the idea here is to actually move beyond that. And so in, like at the university level, I know that they have to be able to compete in the US, Canada, and the UK at least, they'll have to have completed an online education program before you're eligible to compete. So, you know, they should have that basic knowledge. Now, the reality is a lot of them are just sitting there watching TV and pressing the buttons until it's done. And so they don't necessarily take anything in, but they will have been briefed with that. So what we aim to do with React is to make sure that they know that the things that we're talking about, like when we talk about dietary supplements, we're saying, okay, you know, these are high risk. Here's some of the most recent research demonstrating, you know, that 19% were recently found to have a contaminant or something in them that wasn't on the label that was banned, kind of getting them alert to that. And then we signpost them to resources. Like if you're gonna use them, make sure that you use ones that have gone through batch testing. So we'll give them that. But we're not spending a lot of time around like, here's the facts and figures, because most of them know that. And yet they're choosing, or they're in situations where they're led to engage with those types of things. So instead, we're trying to have conversation more where they're having the conversation. So, you know, if they know that stuff, and yet when we give them a scenario about dietary supplements and their reaction is, oh, that's not a problem, that gives us an indication that actually maybe a message is missing here. And so we can start thinking about what's the piece that's missing. Is it that they don't know enough about dietary supplements, or is it that they think they're so necessary to be successful that they choose to do that anyways? And so it's more learning from them in that sense, but we make sure that they have enough knowledge to be able to have this conversation, but we're not sitting there with, here's every list that, you know, all the banned ingredients on the prohibited, here's the list, here's how you get it, here's what you need to know, but let's actually have conversation around it. So it's not meant to, but it's, that being said, it's not meant to replace the information dissemination compliance-based message. That's an important message. This is more the step beyond that of like, let's, instead of just looking to protect athletes, let's empower them. So we can protect them by giving them information, but we can empower them by teaching them and giving them skills to actually apply that and make their own decisions. And so this would be kind of the next step, I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.